where I'm trying to get used to using Teams as well as everything else that's going on there, but hopefully we'll get through the session. So just to let you know a bit about myself and my interest in this topic, I guess, is because it stemmed from initially doing some research and work around older people in a prison environment, first of all. And I'll draw on some of that research that I conducted with people who were in prison for the first time in later life and what their experiences were, particularly around induction and transition into prison. You're probably aware that the issue of older people in prisons has received some academic and policy attention for some time, but the issues are particularly around thinking about how that might translate into probation practice as well, because obviously there's been much less of an attention placed on people actually coming into probation settings than there are into the prison type environment as well. So I'm going to be looking a little bit about that and what that means in terms of what those numbers look like for the numbers of older people on those probation caseloads. One of the things I'll be trying to think about are some of the synergies between gerontology, so academic disciplines and policy disciplines that focus around the experiences of people in later life in society at large, and how that might translate across to some of the ideas and approaches we might use in criminology, and how that might translate into probation practice as well. Hopefully there'll be opportunities for debates around ageism. I think that's one of the issues that we face in society at the moment, is the pervasive nature of ageism in society. The World Health Organization have said that ageism is as pervasive as racism and as sexism, and you've only got to look at the responses to COVID-19 to see how widespread some of those examples have been as well. Sometimes when I'm talking about older people's experiences as well, there's a bit of whataboutery that comes into this. So, you know, what about younger people? What about other experiences? Are they not just the same experiences? And I think because there's so many diverse experiences of aging, people can be healthy and older, they can be unhealthy, and they can have all sorts of different issues just as younger people can. It can be tricky to justify taking action sometimes. I think the Ministry of Justice themselves, when they were looking at reasons why not to have an older person strategy, for example, for the criminal justice system, said it's because the diverse experiences, people's experiences are so different. But that's not something that we say about other people with protected characteristics. So when we're thinking about issues relating to race and gender, that debate's kind of moved on from there, really. And of course, we've got the issues around the double discrimination that can take place by somebody being older, and the issues around ageism, but also the stigma that might also go with having a criminal record, and of course then further layers around intersectionality that will further compound some of these potential issues as well. Also, in terms of probation, looking at probation being an ageing staff base as well, an ageing population there, and the challenges that staff might be facing for themselves in this sort of context as well. So we'll be thinking about some of those different areas as well, and how that might then call for ways of working and things that we might be able to do differently in the future, particularly when looking at the fact that we probably do need that national response, that national overarching policy and strategy, but then we also need to think about how we can translate that into local responses, particularly given that we're thinking about active citizenship and different ways that we might think about older people and their experiences. So age, of course, is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, just in the same way as sex, gender, race, religion, etc. And equally, the same types of discrimination on the basis of age are exactly the same for categories as well. So you can have direct discrimination, where people are directly discriminated on the basis of their age. You can have indirect discrimination, where on paper it looks as though people are receiving a similar level of service, but actually the effects of that service or measure actually leads to worse outcomes for certain populations. It can include victimisation, and it also includes harassment as well. When we're thinking about age, there's lots of different ways that we think about age and ageing. So this can be quite tricky sometimes as well when we're conceptualising what we mean by it. So you have some definitions that talk about this biological process of ageing, which is a process from birth all the way through to death. But that's often couched in terms of kind of areas of growth and improvements in life, through to a process of decline and quite negative connotations that might be associated with that. You might have chronological age, obviously an arbitrary number, and in many places that's ascribed a bit of a social meaning. So age and the chronological age that you are may have different authority in different societies, and based much more around kind of the rules and the norms and the expectations in society themselves. So again, quite often when we're talking about age in a criminal justice context, it will be a chronological number that's selected, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment as well. Functional.
Hi, Nichola.
Yeah.
We can't see your slides anymore.
Oh, they're gone.
Could you be able to share again?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, we can see them at the start.
Nothing worse
Thank
is that when people are chatting away. Thanks for letting me know that. Let me just double check on. Can you see that now, Emily?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. So this slide was just talking about the different areas of age and ageing and the different theories attached to it. And the functional ageing definition looks at both the rate and the effects of ageing that people might have as well, and the fact that that might well be different for different types of people and the different opportunities that they've had there. And what derived from the functional definitions of age turned into talking about successful ageing and the positive notions that might be attached to age and ageing. But one of the issues around successful ageing was that it was very much placed on the emphasis of that individual to take responsibility for themselves, to look after their health and well-being, to engage appropriately in society, and those assumptions that people have got those mechanisms and structures that they might need to enable them to do that as well. So the World Health Organization moved towards more of a definition of what they call active ageing, and this is quite a useful way of thinking about age and ageing because it enables you to look at it at an individual level, at a population level, and also at a society level as well. And I'm just going to read from my notes the World Health Organization definition of active ageing, and they talk about it in terms of optimizing opportunities for health, participation and security in order to enhance the quality of life as people age. So that's quite a nice way of thinking about the different ways in which we interact with people across the whole life course, really. And obviously, again, as the Commission for Human Rights talks about, any kind of measures that are designed to increase opportunities for one particular protective characteristic or any kind of diversity measure always has knock-on benefits for broader groups in society as well. So that's possibly one of the areas we might think about today as well. Obviously, when we're thinking about issues relating to ageing, some quite big issues there in terms of how people might define ageism for themselves. So there's this whole issue around terror management, people's fear about getting older, their awareness about their own mortality, other people perhaps who might be going through issues around ill health and death and bereavement, and that's kind of way of managing that anxiety that people might feel about age and the perceptions that they feel other people might have about them as a consequence of getting older as well. There's issues around what we might call the intergroups, so the in-groups and the out-groups, and that threat around power and resources, particularly in societies where older people might not be viewed in terms of their experience, their skills, the wisdom that they might perhaps bring and the perspectives they might bring to things as well, and that threat that might actually entail. And then you've got that sort of stereotype embodiment as well. And this is one of the issues that is really difficult, isn't it? Because it's very easy to fall into those kind of stereotypical tropes of, you know, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, for example, and different ways that people might, you know, talk about themselves in that sort of way of having, you know, I've had a bit of a senior moment, or different ways in which they might stereotype themselves and take on board those societal views about what it means to be an older person in society as well, which then obviously then potentially can reinforce some of those prejudices and some of those stereotypes as well. And I think this next slide for me, I think it's the embodiment for myself and my experience around age and ageing, because when I first started looking at this issue around older prisoners, and we were looking at ages around 50 plus, and that to me was, you know, a long way in the future, and it wasn't something I particularly identified with. But I do quite like this quote about, you know, when somebody says 30 years ago, I do think that's a long, long time ago, but actually we're talking about time when, you know, I was in secondary school now, so it really doesn't feel that long ago as well. And it's actually really important because there's always these generational shifts that are taking place alongside that population issue as well. And it's not just about the us and the thems, and it's not about the boomers versus the millennials and the kind of language that you see played out in the media, but people's real life experiences and their life course does influence the nature of their transitions. that can also be obviously embedded in terms of that trajectory through the life course, through the inequalities that they might have experienced through the different areas of their systems around education, health, social security, etc., that have changed through time as well. So when we looked at some of the prison research from the 1990s, for example, when Elaine Crawley first started doing quite a lot of work around prisons and age, a lot of the people she was talking to were people who had gone through the austerity following the end of the Second World War. They'd been involved in national service, for example. So their experiences that they drew on to give them strength when they were in prison would be very different, perhaps, to the next generations that would come along. So one of the things I'll talk about later today, when we're talking about this older population, these are the people who, you know, were now in the 1980s, the first people who saw the first wave of the heroin epidemic, for example, or people who were involved perhaps with the rave cultures. So it's very different frames of reference that people use in throughout time as well, and it's something that we need to be bearing in mind when we're thinking about these issues as well. I can always remember one of the people I interviewed in prison had got the same date of birth as my granddad, and that really brought it home to me as well, in terms of that, you know, that relationship that you do have with those different generations as well. So when we're thinking about age and ageing and the criminal justice context, in society, obviously the criminal justice system will be to an extent a reflection of what's going in society at large, and we do know we have got a globally aging population. So by 2050, 2 billion people worldwide will be aged over 50, compared to 1 billion only a couple of years ago. So it's really a presenting issue, and we know, again, it's issues that we hear talking about in government policy around care for older people, around social care, NHS costs, pensions, etc. is a real issue for governments to be looking at in terms of these populations here. And that's played out in the UK as well, because those aged over 65 are our fastest growing population, and by 2050 a quarter of people will be aged over 65, compared with a fifth in 2018. We've now got a situation where 1 in 3 workers are aged over 50 as well. And obviously we know the retirement age is also increasing alongside that as well. And we've actually not just got people getting older in society, but actually the number of people who are reaching 90 plus in terms of their age as well is also increasing. So, you know, people getting very old in terms of their ages. And again, as I say, because of these things, we're thinking about what's happening in society and how that might then focus across into the criminal justice system. And, you know, there is this issue around the social constructs of age. So different research, depending on what you read, will define older people in the criminal justice system very differently. HMPPS and Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons use 50 as their age for older people in the prison system, and that's partly because of research that shows for people in prison who are aging, they tend to have more accumulated disadvantages throughout their life course. The poor conditions that people find themselves in prison exacerbates health issues as well. And so research has seen that physiologically people in prison have got an age of 10 years older than their counterparts in the community as well. So again, that's one of the debates that to be thinking about in terms of probation context as well, because obviously that's attributed to people in prison, but for people on probation, is 50 still the age that would be looking at? And I'd probably argue it probably will be, partly because obviously some of the people on probation will also have been people who've been in prison previously, but also the Centre for Ageing Better and other policy organisations are increasingly using 50 as that starting point for people entering into being seen as being older in society, and the different transitions that they might be going throughout that period as well. So that's a really interesting thing to think about. We know in the criminal justice system, at the younger end of the scale, and again the same rings true in terms of probation context as well, there's often been a focus on young people, those aged under 18 obviously particularly, but also that issue around the transition where people might be moving from young offender environments into adult services for the first time, and this recognition particularly around maturity, brain developments, etc., and this notion of transition for people particularly aged between 18 and 24. And that's where a lot of the research has tended to focus when we've looked at age. It's tended to be towards that younger end of the system versus the system. There has been obviously research around older people as victims in the criminal justice system, and again this has obviously got some resonance for probation when you're thinking about victim work as well, but we do know that people aged 50 plus are the fastest growing population in the prison system, and as I say, there's been lots of debate over the last 20 or 30 years about whether or not we need a strategy for older offenders. The Ministry of Justice have committed to that, and they did say they would be publishing that last year, but it's not actually come out yet, so it can be interesting to see what's actually in there. But a lot of the consultation and a lot of the questions around that have been primarily focused around prisons, around the allocations of people in prison, around people's movement through the prison system, and around support around release planning, but nothing particularly around probation practice and community practice per se. So lots of different areas in terms of age in the criminal justice system, and this notion of 25,000 people being aged over 50 on probation caseloads that I'll talk about a bit more. So when we're thinking about, I guess, the learning from what we've seen about older prisoners in particular, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, I'd recommend the Prison Reform Trust Bromley briefings that give you up-to-date data around prison populations and numbers. And what they talk about is the typology, the type of people who might be in prison at an older age. So they talk about people who are serving repeated sentences, and obviously as their sentences are repeated, the chances are they're serving longer sentences and aging as a consequence of the revolving door of imprisonment. You'll have some people in prison who have been there for a long sentence and so have aged while they've been in prison. They might have gone into prison in their 30s and they're still in prison into their 50s. You have got a smaller cohort of people who might be short-term first-time prisoners, and you've also got those longer-term first-time prisoners as well, who tend to be in there for historic offences. And I think this is often where people make the assumption, particularly in prisons, where if you see somebody who's older in prison, it's actually somebody who is there as a consequence of a historic sex offence. That's often, the perception that's there, that older prisoners are sex offenders. Now, people who've been convicted of sex offences are the largest population there. That 45% of people over 50 have been convicted of a sex offence in prison. However, that does also mean, obviously, 55% haven't, and the next highest proportion of offences has been for violent offences, and then the one after that, at only 8%, is drug offences. So again, quite a mixed bag in terms of the different types of offences that people are in prison for. So as I say, we do talk about it in terms of 50 as the cut-off point or the starting point in this populations as well. But we've actually got huge numbers in the prison population at the moment. 13,000 people aged over 50, 1,600 people aged over 70, and of those, over 300 were aged over 80 as well. So, real differences there in terms of that age in perspective. The increases are projected to increase by a quarter in the next 4 years, and in fact we're already seeing that already in terms of the proportion of older people who are currently on remand in prisons, as well as also increase. So it does look like that those projections are potentially going to come to bear as well, particularly if we're looking at ongoing delays around people coming to trial from being on remand as well. Lots of as I say, the issue around the 44% of convicted of sex offences there, but also a third of people who are on indeterminate sentences for public protection are aged over 50 as well. So again, real entrenched issues there that kind of go alongside their sentence and their experiences of their time in custody as well. The focus does tend to be on older men in prisons when you look at the research, but again, when we're looking at the number of women aged over 50 in prison, 481 women are in prison as well, and that's 15% of that population, so a very similar proportion to the male population, even if the numbers are lower there. And I think that's definitely an area that needs re-emphasis and refocusing as well. The majority of research around that kind of might have the relevant links into probation has tended to be more around sort of release planning, and lots of research that talks about release planning not being existent. It was a large NHS funded project a couple of years ago as well, looking at release planning and needs, and it tends to be around people's needs prior to being released. There's been very few pieces of research that have carried people through following release to see what their actual experiences and what their issues have been. And there's some work undertaken a few years ago by Adrian Hayes, etc., who found that older people in prison had on average 5.7 where the 0.7 come from is an interesting one, needs in terms of resettlement as well. So again, how does that get carried through into resettlement work for staff on probation as well? Obviously, we know there are going to be differences in terms of people's health, but actually up to 85% of older prisoners have got some form of chronic illness as well. So again, the exacerbation of people's health conditions and ability to perhaps engage in various aspects of the prison regime and what that might mean for them and their needs on release, particularly when we think about the Care Act, when that came into 2014, which placed a statutory duty on local authorities to include prisons in terms of their populations and what that means for people being able to access care while they're in prison, but again, what that means for people on release, especially for those people who may pose additional risks, may have need for approved premises accommodation, etc., may need specially adapted accommodation, and what that means for move on accommodation as well. And so what a lot of the research focuses on in terms of older prisoners is this whole notion of institutional thoughtlessness, that prisons are designed for younger men, they're designed around people coming out of prison, perhaps looking for employment opportunities on release. The average age of people in prison is 27. So again, that sort of constant reiteration of what the needs of that population might be as well. And I think when you think about some of the learning that might come through from probation from the prison perspective, you've got all these issues around age and care and social care needs and issues potentially around disabilities. So ensuring accommodation that's compliant with DDA regulations, the whole issues around carceral geography and people's ability to be able to get their food appropriately while they're in the prison. They might need buddies to help them there. There might be issues around mobility. I've certainly seen that in a lot of the open prisons where people are placed in very large physical estates, which makes it actually quite difficult to get around as well. The ability to follow the regime and instructions, especially if people are experiencing cognitive decline. What type of regime is available to people? I've certainly been in prisons where there's been quite a lot of opportunities for people who are older, but actually when you look at when they take place, there was one time I can remember where the older people's gym session and their social group were both on the same time and same day, so it was a choice of either or. It wasn't something that they're able to get involved in both of those things. You have those issues around in prisons whether older people should be placed separately to younger people, or whether actually it should be mirroring society at large and have that opportunity for intergenerational contact and opportunities around those sorts of areas. And the whole issues around health more generally. Palliative care for prisoners as well, people who we know are going to die in prison, and what their needs are and what sort of issues do we have around dying with dignity for expected deaths, but also obviously when we have unexpected deaths, and again that's something obviously that happens to people on probation in the community settings as well, and what the impact of that death might be for their families, for other prisoners, and of course for the staff themselves who are working on those things. In prisons there's obviously NHS commissioned services as well. So quite often there's needs assessments based around that population so that people are aware of how many older prisoners they've got, what sort of long-term conditions they might have, what their needs might be around accessing that care, and of course what the implications might be if they then need to access secondary care in hospital treatment as well. And obviously issues around substance misuse and mental health also get pulled up as part of that needs assessment process. And of course we do have aspects of issues relating to health in probation settings and looking at health needs, but a lot of that does again tend to focus more towards the mental and the substance misuse side of things, and the links with NHS commissioning as well. So I'm going to broadly talk a little bit very briefly about the research I did when I was talking to some first time older prisoners, because I think there is some resonance here around this whole issue around their life courses and their experiences and their expectations here. It was some qualitative interviews I undertook with prisoners who were going to a category C prison, and they were specifically going to that prison for the programmes that were available to them in that prison. When I was particularly interested in their experiences of induction and that transition into that sort of environment, and they do talk about that entry shock and their life before coming to prison and their inability to make arrangements for things like accommodation, finance, etc. So I think this is one of those first jumping off points where people think about younger people and say, well, you know, younger people will have these issues as well, but obviously for older people, especially if they have been established in their career, if they have had more of a settled family life, if they've got appropriate accommodation, etc., the impact of that is likely to be somewhat different. And of course we know, as I say, although all of the older people have not necessarily all committed sex offences, we will know that actually for some people that you'll be working with, actually their position, their status will have actually been an enabler for some of their offending behaviour to have taken place as well. But when you look at these quotes from the people that I talked to, you know, they were talking about this issue about being brought up in a different generation, being taught discipline, being able to discipline yourself and to actually sort of endure what's being given to you in the prison. One of the other quotes that one of the men I spoke to quite often was saying was, what can't be cured must be endured, and that was the kind of his mantra for getting himself through that process. People's anxieties about not knowing how to cancel contracts, what to do, and also the fact that if you're older on the inside of prison, your family members themselves on the outside will also potentially be older and may also have issues themselves in terms of abilities to engage in some of these things. People talking about anxieties around family visits and confidence of driving, for example, and worries about moving to other prisons. And this came out about not wanting to go to a Cat D because they were worried about that longer journey they'd have to make. And this whole issue that no one sits you down and goes through all the ways you can get into trouble. There was an assumption for the people I talked to that they had been in prison before, that they knew the score, they knew what they needed to do, and they were supposed to kind of to get on with it, really. But it was really interesting because a lot of the people, when I was talking to them, they were talking about their experiences, and instead of couching it in terms of the national insurance example, national service, example there, people were talking about induction in prison in comparison to a welcome meet on holiday or an induction in the workplace. So again, that life experience that they brought with them gave them a very different perspective in terms of their expectations of what they were going to receive when they went into prison. And again, I think the bit that for me it was interesting, that it has also got some resonance potentially for probation practice, was this sort of ambivalence and antipathy about the programmes that they were being asked to get involved with in the prison, which obviously for many of them will have been a precursor for parole conditions as well. People talking there about the use of programmes, particularly around their previous experiences and their education levels. And again, when I was talking earlier about the sort of those internalisations of those stereotypes, you know, I've been around the block, I'm not going to learn anything new about myself, so kind of what's the point of going on these programmes when you're older and you've got that experience already. Another person talking about the fact that they're worried because they haven't had the chance to go on the programme yet, and they'd be angry if they didn't get to go on a programme at all because they wanted to have that kind of insight, an opportunity to demonstrate their progression. And again, somebody else saying they've not done the sentence plan yet. I'm not on drugs, I've not got an alcohol issue, I'm not violent, so they don't seem to know what to do with me. So this, again, that ambivalence, and whether that's obviously about neutralising their behaviours or not necessarily taking responsibility, is obviously matters for debate on there. But again, that whole issue around people positioning their experience to date and their life experience and how they translate that across into what's happening to them and what's potentially being perceived as being done to them is particularly important on that score. So that's just a bit of background around sort of where I've come from in terms of prison perspectives, and obviously the next part of it will be focused much more around probation. But that's kind of what prompted me to think about probation, that we've got these numbers of people in prison, high proportions of people who are older, who are going to be coming out of prison, many of them who will be subject to licence conditions. But it got me thinking obviously about people on community orders and suspended sentences, etc., and what that might look like for probation practice. And it was actually quite hard to find the numbers because, again, with the prison population data, that's regularly broken down into the regular statistical bulletins where you can pick out those relevant numbers of how many people, etc. In that. But there isn't anything similar in the public domain for probation caseloads in the same way. Similarly, with the HMI inspections for prisons, they include as part of their expectations around the protected characteristics. So they will often have a section that is dedicated around the experiences of older people in that specific prison. And again, HMI probation tends to be more of a general sort of reflection around diversity issues as well. So in the end, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Ministry of Justice, everyone's favourite thing to land on their desks, to ask about the and the ages on there. Schoolgirl error on my part, because I didn't ask them to further break it down. I only went down to age. I didn't then look at things like gender and race, and obviously they would be things that we would need to look at. But I was also mindful that the time that these sorts of requests take, the more you ask for, the less likely you are for your request to be granted and to be followed through. So what we found here was 26,830 people on probation caseloads are aged over 50. So 1 in 6 people on probation are aged over 50. And you can see that breakdown on the chart there in terms of how the proportions have changed over time. Now, obviously, you've got things like the Offender Rehabilitation Act potentially influencing some of these areas as well. But you can see up there, you know, the increase in the proportion of people who are subject to licence and post-sentence supervision over time there. But it's still relatively large numbers in terms of community orders. Stayed quite static, but there has been that increase there in terms of these things. And obviously, this is data from 3 years ago now as well. So again, how has that changed and what's been the impact and knock on potentially for COVID and other things as well? 21% of people who are on licence are actually past retirement age. So again, that's got implications in terms of pathways that we're thinking about traditionally around employment or finance, etc. And of those people on licence, 37 of them are aged over 90 nationally as well. So again, different dynamics in terms of what their needs might be. And again, I think there's quite often attention paid to people in approved premises and age in there, because that's often where people, again, if they've been convicted of sex offence, obviously they may well have requirements around residing in approved premises prior to post-release. So this is again showing some of the data around the ages and numbers of people in approved premises over this 4-year period. There were some people aged over 80 in the approved premises, but because of the low numbers, the data was suppressed for that, but obviously they are there as well. 20% are aged over 50, and 20% of those are again over retirement age as well. So again, not small numbers in terms of the people that we're talking about. Obviously, within approved premises, there's the whole issue in the specification around the appropriateness of the regime and the activities that are available for people. But it does also pose the question in terms of accessibility, DDA compliance, and potential move on accommodation for people who are leaving those approved premises. And even things like, you know, the implications of disclosure. Even if people are going back to their own homes, for example, implications around disclosure. If they have got needs under the Care Act, how is that communicated and information shared appropriately? And how does that transfer into if people need to eventually go into care homes? You know, again, there's a debate in the prison system about should we be looking at secure care homes? But again, that's something that potentially is going to be more of an issue in community settings as well. So when I was talking about the prison experiences, we were talking about that particular typology and the type of prisoners that you tend to find there. So if you think about that in terms of translating it into probation practices, you're likely to have got sort of again these similar 4 cohorts of people. Really, you're likely to have got people who've not gone through this traditional desistance trajectory of growing out of crime. So these might be people who are on your IOM schemes. It might be people who've got that entrenched substance misuse issues. Equally, it could be people who have been convicted of an offence for the first time in later life, and with it being a first-time offence, the culpability and the nature of the offence might mean that they are may receive a community order rather than a custodial sentence. And again, there's some debate at the moment about the extent to which that's likely to also increase at the moment with the cost of living crisis and the different issues that people are potentially finding themselves in. There's going to be people on probation on a standard licence who've obviously been in custody and coming back out again, but then you've also obviously got people on probation who might have got extended licences and subject to additional restrictions, particularly around MAPA arrangements as well. So that's potentially a way of thinking about the different populations that people might be working with throughout their time on probation. And so when we start to think about what we look at when we're looking at gerontology as a discipline and the ways in which they talk about older people and the interventions that help people to make sense of their lives and their ageing, what I've tried to do is compare and contrast a couple of areas to show that actually there's a lot of synergy between what you do in probation already and what different aspects of good practice might be in terms of working with older people. Obviously what's needed is that holistic approach and that individualised approach to working with people. So if you think about in gerontology, a big area of research is around people's life course and narrative perspectives, where people are able to tell the stories of their lives to date and their strengths and their achievements and the significance of their relationships, etc. This could be through something like a life history calendar, it might be documentary approaches, it might be ethnographic research. It could also be looking with people to look at their social networks and what their important transitions have been in their lives. And of course, that's something that probation practitioners are well versed at in terms of getting that story and capturing that history of people to help to think about what that future self could potentially look like. So some real good synergies there in terms of giving people that time and space, which I know again is another challenge in terms of probation practice, but to enable people to tell their story and to make those links and those synergies in there. We've got active ageing that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, and this maps on really well to things like your Good Lives Matter, Good Lives model in terms of the different ways in which people can feel positive about their experiences and the changes there. When we look at active ageing, it includes components such as people's physical health and how well they're able to function, how well they make use of leisure time. And again, that's really important for people who might have passed retirement age and are not looking for work when alongside their other experiences. It includes people's social contacts. And again, we know that people's social contacts do diminish through age. So where and how do people have those social contacts? What sort of appropriate and positive contacts can be facilitated to enable some of those changes. And again, this is where things like with your COSA initiatives with sex offenders as well, that this is a really important aspect of what work goes on there. It's also around how well people keep themselves mentally well and mentally active. It's how well people have access to support. So obviously that would be around probation, but how well are probation staff able to signpost to other community resources that might be of benefit to older people who are on probation as well. It's about people's outlook. So again, thinking about the positives and helping people to make sense of their situation, help them to move forward with that. But active ageing also includes things like their financial circumstances as well. So again, that's going to be a real significant issue for many of the people that you're working with on probation. But it's all bound under, I guess, the whole issues around people's empowerment, their inherent dignity, their respect for human rights, and also an enabling environment as well, which again is language that we do use in a criminal justice context. But here it's used in a slightly different way to think about what is it about the environment that will actually help people to make the most of that place that people are in. And the one that I've picked out particularly, obviously, that links well with the Good Lives model is this whole issue of generativity, this notion of giving back, the meaning that people's lives have, and how well they're able to translate that meaning into practice. So again, things like volunteering opportunities, getting people involved in community environments, the passing on of skills and knowledge to other generations as well is a big important part of that, and the potential for mentoring and the mastery of new skills that might come alongside those things. Healthy cities, again, fits in well with things like the enabling environment, but again, on the back of reunification of probation, what thought is being given to the places that probation practices take place, the hubs sort of environment that a number of places have adopted, the pains of probation people have experienced in terms of travel to get to different appointments, etc., and how interconnected are people's lives to enable them to actually be an active citizen in addition to someone who's also experiencing probation. Service users as change agents is a really important aspect in terms of gerontological approaches, you know, asking people about their experiences and what they want to see change and what works well. And again, within the probation framework around service user consultation, etc., there's a real opportunity there to talk to cohorts of people and to find out what works for them and to help them to enable and facilitate those changes and to co-produce and co-design some of those areas as well. And obviously things around strength-based approaches underpins all of these things. It's about helping people to maximise what they've got, to focus on their strengths, their abilities, their skills, what they have still got to offer, versus the sort of period of decline that people might sometimes associate with ageing as well. And you know, historically probation has been placed in a community context with those networks, with those partnership agreements, and you know, there's issues around being able to bring that back in and to support people around those things. Systematic reviews of the social needs of older people has shown that any interventions for older people should focus on connectedness, participation, independence, which again have really important resonance for probation practices and issues relating to areas around recovery and assistance narratives as well. So when we're thinking about reframing some of these interactions, it's the whole issue of, is age a static or a dynamic risk factor? Obviously, age as a number is what it is, but the issues that are changing around that for people as they age and the different conditions and requirements that might change through that might mean having to respond in different ways to that notion and to that answer. We've got the issue around the typologies. We've got the sort of the different types of ways of thinking about how we might work with various cohorts of people and whether that needs to be built around specific skill sets for probation staff, and different interventions and ways of working with that kind of segmentation. As I mentioned with some of my quotes from the interviews I did with the older people, with first-time prisoners, what does that mean in terms of their concepts of the legitimacy of the probation supervision that they might be experiencing? How compliant are they likely to be? You know, the HMI prisons thematic inspections around older people, they've always talked about them being no problems, they're old, they're quiet, you know, they're not likely to kick off and cause the same sort of issues. But what does that mean in terms of substantive compliance with people's orders, particularly if they have got this ambivalence about how able they are to make those changes and how able they are to think about and reflect on some of the sort of the negative behaviours that they've enacted previously, and how does that translate into perhaps techniques around neutralisation and minimising their responsibilities as well. And that whole issue around health, well-being and dignity as an older citizen, as well as somebody who's on probation as well. So, you know, how well versed are probation in terms of bringing in services into probation. Some areas have had health trainers in it, for example, in the past. How well are we able to signpost those different areas, and how much does people's day-to-day challenges influence how well they're able to actively engage with their probation requirements as well. So when we're thinking about some of those reoffending pathways as well, how might we need to think slightly differently around some of these sorts of areas? So in terms of education, for some of the people who might be older on probation, they might be more likely to have had a higher level of education than some of the younger people that people might have been working with, and what that prior attainment might look like in terms of their skills, their abilities, their knowledge. The importance of lifelong learning, and again, this is another area that the government are very keen to increase and develop for people, the opportunities to access lifelong learning opportunities, and the opportunity to kind of share skills and that intergenerational generativity as well. And obviously for some people, this is not going to be the case. They might not have aged well. They will have had this compounded disadvantage as they age as well. So it is always difficult to balance those different experiences. But it is about thinking differently, that the pathways might be there still and still have relevance, but they might need adapting and thinking about in a slightly different way for different populations. As I say, with work, retirement ages are increasing. Financially, a lot of people might feel they can't afford to stop working as well. But obviously you've got that issue of double jeopardy of having a criminal record and your age if you're looking for work. But equally is that issue about transitioning into retirement. I know certainly here at Sheffield Hallam, for example, we have workshops and courses available for people when they're thinking about retirement and what that might mean for them and how to adapt positively to that transition as well. So again, that might be something that people might be worried about and thinking about, especially in terms of their use of time, their sense of identity that might have come from that if they have been working previously, and what that might mean going forward as well. Obviously, again, there's issues around what sort of work people are able to do as well, particularly if we're thinking about particular types of offences. When we're thinking about accommodation, I know one of the people that I was talking to when I was doing my interviews, as part of their licence conditions, they weren't able to go back to their former home. So it was a case that his wife was having to sell their family home that they'd lived in for the last 50 years while he was in prison, and sort of the worries and anxieties that was causing him in terms of what it meant for his wife on the outside. But again, that issue around quality of accommodation as well. Nationally, 2 million people over 55 are living in accommodation that's deemed to be unfit for them in terms of their health and their well-being. So again, if we're looking at that compounding of wealth and accommodation and all these other factors that influence someone through their life course, you can see how that might play out for some of the people that we'll be working with on probation as well. As I mentioned as well, obviously issues around approved premises, if people are needing to move into approved premises, and the balance of younger and older people in those approved premises spaces, and the potential around different behaviours that might be played out in that setting as well. When we're thinking about family issues, obviously you've got the whole issues around transitions and family demographic changes, older people perhaps becoming grandparents for the first time, and what that might mean in terms of various issues and either risks or opportunities. Increases around things around divorce, separation, bereavement. These are all going to be particular challenges and potential triggers for people in terms of some of their behaviours as well. People will increasingly have caring commitments for both older and younger family members as well as going through ageing yourselves, and that's obviously something I'll pick up in a moment around probation staff as well, that we're trying to juggle all these different things potentially at the same time. And issues around loneliness potentially as well, if people are going through these processes and haven't got those connections and those social networks in place there. When we're thinking about things around finances, people might, obviously, as I said earlier, might have to try and stay in work longer because they can't afford to retire, but also obviously depending on if they've been in prison previously, if they've not had national insurance contributions, have they got access to the pensions that they need? Are there other state benefits that they might wish to look into and be entitled to? But we do know increasingly, again from research, that older people are a population increasingly living in poverty as well. And of course, further down the line, for some people, it might be looking at things around paying for their care or paying for the care of their loved ones alongside that as well. In terms of substance misuse, older people are more likely to misuse opiates than younger people. Issues around people, thinking about the people in drug treatment, half of those in drug treatment are now aged over 40, with an average age of 46 in there. 69% of people who used heroin used it before 2001. So again, just as a reminder, 2001 is 20 years ago. It's not the 10 years ago that I still think of it in my head. So again, those issues are going to be compounded perhaps with some of the older people that we might be talking to, and the increased recognition of alcohol issues amongst older people, and the relative lack. Obviously we know residential rehabilitation is problematic for all age groups, but in particular for older people to access that's been seen as a particular barrier and challenge for people who are wanting to go into residential treatment as well for those things. And then obviously around mental and physical health, all kinds of different issues that may and do increase as people age. So 1 in 5 people over 50 have got depression, and we also know that mental health issues are even more compounded in the criminal justice system. Issues potentially around dementia and other cognitive decline, and how we actually go about assessing and identifying and supporting people who might have those kind of issues for them at that particular time, and what that might mean for them in terms of compliance with their licence conditions or their supervision requirements, for example, and what it might mean for if people are being required to do unpaid work, and what that might look like. We know that chronic health needs increase as people age, as do disabilities, And so again, what does that mean in terms of their ability to physically engage with the system? How does it compare with if they've got multiple appointments to meet, to have their healthcare needs met alongside their supervision requirements, and the potential around where that might be being accessed in things like telehealth, for example, changing that to an extent. But again, for some older people that won't be an issue in terms of access, but for some other older people, technological skills might mean that they're not as able to access some of the technological health needs that they might need as well. So different ways of looking at the pathways, I think, that require some more thought as we go through. And I think for me, there's opportunities that we might also see as missed opportunities as well when we're thinking about some of these areas. So in terms of the HMPPS equality strategy, nothing mentioned particularly around age. Obviously, we have got an ageing workforce, 50 to 59-year-olds. And again, this is based on the National Probation Service staffing. We didn't have the data for CRC staffing, but when you look at the staff who are employed by HMPPS, those aged 50 to 59 are the largest staff group in that population. But what we also have seen is that they have worse appraisal outcomes than the younger staff. There's an increased number of grievances, and they're less likely to receive bonus payments than younger staff as well. So again, unpicking what some of that might mean in practice is quite important. There's the issue of thinking about the workforce in terms of what De Medeiros calls the sandwich generation, in that people in their 50s are likely in the workforce are likely to have childcare commitments. They might be grappling with their own issues around getting older themselves. Again, a highly feminized workforce. Increasingly, people are starting to think around policies around menopause, for example, and also potentially looking at issues around older parents and care for older parents as well, alongside the issues that we all know around in terms of workloads, caseloads, tensions in the workplace, etc. So really quite challenging balancing acts that people are playing out both in their work lives and in their personal lives as well. But there are potential opportunities, I guess, through policy harmonisation to look at how we can bring some of those different strands together to support people to make the most of their experience and to make sure that they're not, the experienced staff aren't the ones that are walking out the door. And I know that's obviously an issue potentially at the moment as well, and supporting that next generation of people coming through into the workforce as well. Obviously through transforming rehabilitation and the change back to the reunification of probation, the probation framework has commissioned a whole range of different interventions and support services from partnership and voluntary and community sector organisations as well. And again, it was a real shame that there wasn't an opportunity to commission specific interventions and support for people who may be older. There were quite rightly specific competitions to go onto the framework for looking at gender and looking at race, but I think that was a real missed opportunity for looking at interventions with older people. But that's not to say that locally people can't engage with organisations such as Age UK, Recoup, Clinks, the Restore Network, or local grassroots organisations as well to look at some of those things. And I think one of the things I always find really interesting with probation practice as well was, you know, things like the lunch clubs that lots of areas who've done unpaid work have delivered, and you know, they've often been delivered to older populations, and that sort of intergenerational thing there that doesn't necessarily then translate back into that learning from how positive that experience can be. So some real opportunities there in terms of commissioning and looking at those local partnerships. I've mentioned a few times already, obviously, issues around intersectionality, and you know, the experiences of being an older woman will be different, as will the experiences of being an older black male, for example, and thinking about what that presents in terms of people's networks and opportunities as well. In terms of the experiences of older people on probation caseloads, I've not yet come across any research on this particular issue. It's obviously something I'd love to be able to do some research around. So if anyone's got any links and contacts for that, I'd be more than happy to chat with you after the session today around that, because fundamentally it is a real gap at the moment that we're not particularly systematically asking people about their experiences. And as I say, with some of the different organisations on the framework and some of the opportunities that are being presented around service user involvement and consultations, etc., there is a real opportunity to find out about those experiences and to look at co-designing ways of working, so that, you know, we are recognising the fact that older people are the ultimate in experts by experience, because they have got that shed load of experience that could be really used for the benefit of the organisations going forward as well. So thinking about asking people about their experiences and taking on board and working together to collaborate on those sorts of things. And I think fundamentally this, as I say, Elaine Crawley coined the term in prisons, this notion of institutional thoughtlessness, that older people are just not thought about in that way. You know, they're kind of expected that whatever the needs are as adults will be the same, and actually there's lots of opportunities to avoid that institutional thoughtlessness, even if it's just some of the basic things in terms of the terminology and the language that's being used, the imagery that's presented at a minimum level, regardless of sort of more systematic changes that need to take place. So that's been plenty of waffle from me. Hopefully it's given you a bit of food for thought and ways of thinking about how we construct issues relating to older people, and what we need to be thinking about in the future. I've put a few sort of pause for thoughts on there in terms of what would good look like for your perspective. What can we learn from the prison services experiences of working alongside this cohorts for the last sort of 20-30 years? Are there opportunities to build communities and networks to aid those connections? And again, for me, you know, really another really important area about supporting staff to manage the transitions and the issues and the challenges that they may be facing alongside the issues that the people they're working with face as well. So my details are on there as well. So my Twitter handle and also my email address. I'd be more than happy to talk to any of you offline after today's session if it has prompted any sort of thoughts or areas for discussion for the future. There's also some references on the slides as well. I think I should be able to send these out to you afterwards as well following today. Certainly the recording will be sent out as well, so hopefully you'll be able to see them on there. But they're the basic references. I'm going to stop presenting now, and I'm going to stop the recording, and it's over to you guys for any comments or reflections or questions.